November 23rd, 1942. Hermann Göring stood before Adolf Hitler in the Wolf's lair, chest puffed with the confidence of a man who had never spent a winter on the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe could supply Stalingrad by air, he declared. 500 tons daily. Guaranteed. The Sixth Army would hold until relief arrived. Hitler, desperate for any solution that didn't involve the word retreat, believed him. 48 kilometers to the south, in a frozen bunker on the outskirts of Stalingrad, Colonel General Friedrich Paulus read the message with hands that had stopped shaking from cold and started shaking from something else entirely. Hold position. Establish hedgehog defense. Air supply en route. Relief operation being organized. The words were typed neatly on a paper that would burn nicely for warmth, though Paulus wouldn't permit such waste. Not yet. The encirclement had closed 4 days earlier, when Soviet tank columns punched through the Romanian Third Army north of the city and the Romanian Fourth Army to the south, meeting at Calaci-on-Don like the jaws of a trap. 290,000 men of the Sixth Army and parts of 4th Panzer Army were now inside a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. It was, Paulus thought, a temporary situation. The Wehrmacht had broken encirclements before. They would break this one. He was wrong, but he didn't know it yet. The first Luftwaffe transports arrived on November 24th, Junkers 52s lumbering through anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies by parachute. Soldiers watched the containers drift down against gray sky, some landing in German lines, others in Soviet positions, a few in no man's land where men would die trying to retrieve them. They recovered 70 tons of supplies that day. Paulus did the mathematics. 290,000 men required 700 tons of food, ammunition, and fuel daily just to survive. More to fight. 70 tons wouldn't feed them for 3 hours. He sent a message to Army Group Don, now commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the man Hitler had summoned from the Leningrad front to fix the disaster. Ammunition and fuel situation critical. Daily minimum requirement 500 tons. Request clarification on relief timetable. The response came from General Kurt Zeitzler, Chief of the General Staff, a man who had begun to understand what Göring either didn't grasp or refused to admit. Luftwaffe confirms capability. Weather conditions temporarily restricting operations. Situation will improve. Maintain defensive positions. Relief operation being prepared. Temporarily. That word would haunt them. By December 1st, the Luftwaffe had delivered an average of 94 tons daily. On the best day, they managed 280 tons. On the worst, 30. Paulus watched his army begin to starve in slow motion. The official ration dropped to 300 grams of bread per day. Then 200, then 100. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Then the army's dogs. Then soldiers began eyeing the rats. In the bunker that served as 6th Army headquarters, Paulus's chief of staff, Major General Arthur Schmidt, spread the calculations across a table like evidence at a murder trial. At current delivery rates, we have ammunition for 3 weeks of defensive operations. Fuel for the vehicles we still have running is gone in 10 days. Food? He paused. Food is already gone. We're eating what we'll need tomorrow. Paulus stared at the numbers. He was 52 years old, a career officer who had never commanded troops in combat until this year, a staff officer promoted beyond his experience because the Eastern Front consumed generals like firewood. He had led 6th Army into Stalingrad in August, grinding through the city block by block, building by building, room by room. By November, they controlled 90% of the ruins. Then the Soviets had sprung the trap, and 90% of rubble meant nothing when you were surrounded. Request permission to break out, Paulus said. Schmidt nodded. He'd been waiting for this. The message went to Manstein, who forwarded it to Hitler with his own assessment. Sixth Army cannot hold without adequate supply. Air bridge insufficient. Recommend authorize breakout to the southwest while forces retain combat capability. Hitler's response arrived within hours. Fortress Stalingrad will be held. Sixth Army will defend present positions. Relief operation launching shortly. Breakout not authorized. Paulus read it twice, looking for ambiguity he could exploit. There was none. He was ordered to stay, to trust that help was coming, to believe that the Luftwaffe would deliver what it had never delivered, that relief forces would arrive before his army ceased to exist. In East Prussia, in the Wolf's Lair, Zeitzler was discovering what it meant to argue with a man who had conquered France and believed himself a military genius beyond questioning. The Chief of General Staff stood before Hitler's map table, where colored pins showed a situation that bore no resemblance to reality. My Führer, the Luftwaffe cannot supply Stalingrad. The numbers are clear. They've never delivered more than 300 tons in a single day. The army requires 500 minimum. This is mathematics, not opinion. Hitler's hand swept across the map, dismissing mathematics. Göring has assured me. Göring is not in Stalingrad. Zeitzler interrupted, a breach of protocol that made everyone in the room inhale sharply. Göring is not watching men starve. Göring is not counting the aircraft we're losing. 25 transports shot down in the last week alone. We cannot sustain this. The relief operation will break through, Hitler said. Manstein has never failed. Manstein is outnumbered 3-1. The Soviets are bringing up reserves. Every day we wait, Sixth Army grows weaker and the Soviet ring grows stronger. If we authorize breakout now, while the army still has fuel and ammunition, they can fight their way to Manstein's forces and abandon Stalingrad. Hitler's voice rose. Abandon the city that bears Stalin's name. Show the world that the Wehrmacht retreats? Impossible. The army will hold. That is final. Zeitzler tried once more. Then the army will be destroyed. The army will be relieved, Hitler said, and turned back to his maps where phantom divisions waited to be deployed, where supply lines existed on paper but not in reality, where the war was still being won because he refused to acknowledge it was being lost. On December 12th, Operation Winter Storm began. Manstein had assembled what forces he could scrape together. 4th Panzer Army, 3 panzer divisions, several infantry divisions, all under strength, all exhausted from months of combat. They attacked northeast toward Stalingrad, 57 kilometers away, punching through Soviet lines in a thrust that, for 3 days, looked like it might actually work. Inside the pocket, Paulus listened to radio reports of the relief forces' progress. 48 kilometers away, then 45, then 41. The distance shrank daily. His operations officer plotted it on a map, drawing a line that crept toward Stalingrad like hope made visible. If they reach 35 kilometers, we can break out to meet them, Schmidt said. We'll need Hitler's authorization, but if Manstein gets close enough, we have no authorization, Paulus said quietly, and no fuel for a breakout. Even if ordered, we couldn't reach them. This was the arithmetic of doom. To break out, Sixth Army would need fuel for its vehicles, ammunition for fighting through Soviet lines, and enough combat strength to move 290,000 men across 40 kilometers of enemy-held territory in winter. They had none of these things. The Luftwaffe's failures had made the choice for them. Even if Hitler authorized breakout, even if Manstein reached the pocket's edge, Sixth Army couldn't move. They were already dead. They just hadn't stopped breathing yet. On December 19th, Manstein's spearhead reached the Mishkova River, 48 kilometers from Stalingrad's perimeter. 4th Panzer Army's exhausted troops could see the glow of fires from the city at night, could hear the artillery barrages, were close enough that they might have walked the distance in a day if there weren't 3 Soviet armies between them and their objective. Manstein sent a message to Hitler requesting permission for Sixth Army to break out. The two forces could link up, withdraw together, save the trapped army before winter made survival impossible. He marked it urgent. He explained the tactical situation. He noted that this was likely the last opportunity. Hitler's response took 24 hours. 6th Army will hold Stalingrad. 4th Panzer Army will continue relief operation. But 4th Panzer Army couldn't continue. Soviet counterattacks were hammering their flanks. More Soviet divisions were arriving daily. The offensive had stalled not from lack of courage, but from lack of men, lack of tanks, lack of everything except enemies. On December 23rd, Manstein made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered 4th Panzer Army to withdraw. The relief operation had failed. In his command bunker, Manstein drafted the message to Paulus with the care of a man writing a death sentence. 4th Panzer Army unable to maintain positions on Mishkova River, forced to withdraw to defensive line, will attempt to stabilize situation and resume offensive when reinforcements available. He didn't write what both men knew. There were no reinforcements. There would be no second attempt. 6th Army was on its own. Paulus received the message on Christmas Eve. He read it 3 times as if the words might change, then handed it to Schmidt without comment. Outside the bunker, soldiers were singing Silent Night in voices that cracked from hunger and cold. Someone had fashioned a Christmas tree from barbed wire and shell casings. The temperature was 30 below zero. Schmidt read the message and set it down carefully as if it might explode. We should inform the men. Inform them of what? Paulus asked. That help isn't coming. They already know. Look at them. And they did know. The soldiers of 6th Army weren't fools. They could count the supply drops that never came, could feel their own bodies consuming themselves for fuel, could see the Soviet ring tightening daily. They knew the Luftwaffe's promises were lies. They knew the relief force had turned back. They knew they were trapped in a frozen city with no food, no ammunition, and no way out. What they didn't know yet was that their high command had known this would happen and ordered them to stay anyway. By early January, the Luftwaffe had stopped even pretending the air bridge could work. Potomnik Airfield, the main supply base inside the pocket, was under constant artillery fire. Transports landed in darkness, unloaded whatever they carried, sometimes ammunition, sometimes food, once an entire shipment of contraceptives that made starving men laugh until they cried, and took off immediately, often carrying wounded who would die in the unheated cargo holds before reaching safety. The daily supply average dropped to 60 tons, then 40, then 30. Paulus sent message after message to Army Group headquarters, to the General Staff, to anyone who might authorize either breakout or surrender. The responses came from Zeitzler, who was no longer trying to hide his desperation. Führer insists Stalingrad be held to the last man. No authorization for capitulation. Army Group Don attempting to organize new relief operation. There was no new relief operation. Zeitzler was lying because the truth, that Hitler had written off 6th Army, that 290,000 men were being sacrificed for a symbolic victory that meant nothing militarily, was too monstrous to write in an official message. In the Wolf's Lair, Zeitzler had begun doing something unprecedented. He was starving himself in solidarity with 6th Army. He ate only their official ration, 100 grams of bread daily, nothing else. Within 2 weeks, he'd lost 17 pounds. Hitler noticed. You look unwell, Zeitzler. I'm eating what our soldiers in Stalingrad eat, my Führer. Hitler's face darkened. That's absurd. You're needed here. Eat properly. Then let them eat properly. Authorize the breakout while they still can. The subject is closed, Hitler said, and it was. On January 10th, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final assault to crush the pocket. Artillery bombardment that lasted 5 hours, then infantry and tanks attacking from all sides. The pocket began to shrink. Potomnik Airfield fell on January 16th. Gumrak Airfield, the last landing strip, fell on January 22nd. Now supplies could only be dropped by parachute, and most drifted into Soviet hands. Paulus moved his headquarters into the basement of the Univermag department store in central Stalingrad, a bunker complex that was already overcrowded with wounded men who would never be evacuated. The smell was indescribable. The sounds were worse. On January 24th, he sent his final request for permission to surrender. The message was formal, precise, the language of a staff officer reporting on a situation that happened to be his own destruction. Troops without ammunition and food. Effective command no longer possible. 18,000 wounded without medical supplies or dressings. Further defense senseless. Catastrophe inevitable. Request permission to surrender to save lives of remaining troops. The response came from Hitler personally, transmitted through Zeitzler, who later said he felt physically ill reading it aloud. Surrender is out of the question. 6th Army will hold to the last man in the last round, thereby making an unforgettable contribution to the salvation of the Western world. The Western world. As if starving men in a Russian basement were somehow preventing the collapse of civilization by refusing to surrender. Paulus showed the message to his staff. No one spoke. What was there to say? They had asked for permission to save their men's lives and been told that their deaths would be more useful. The arithmetic was complete. High Command, Hitler, had decided that 6th Army's value was in dying slowly enough to tie down Soviet forces in creating a heroic myth of German resistance in anything except survival. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, a final message arrived. Hitler was promoting Paulus to Field Marshal. The ceremony was announced on German radio, while Paulus crouched in his bunker, listening to Soviet tanks grinding through the rubble overhead. Schmidt understood immediately. No German field marshal has ever surrendered. He's ordering you to kill yourself. Paulus stared at the promotion order. It was signed by Hitler, countersigned by Keitel, stamped with official seals. A beautiful document. He could burn it for warmth, but it wouldn't last long. I have no intention of shooting myself for that Bohemian corporal, Paulus said, using the contemptuous term that officers applied to Hitler in private. It was the first time Schmidt had heard him say it aloud. On February 2nd, 1943, Paulus surrendered. Soviet soldiers found him in the Univermag basement, surrounded by wounded men and the smell of gangrene. He was gaunt, exhausted, and utterly defeated. When asked why he hadn't committed suicide as Hitler expected, Paulus said simply, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this man." 91,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Most would never return. Of the 290,000 men trapped in Stalingrad, 150,000 were already dead. The news reached Hitler's headquarters on February 3rd. Zeitzler delivered the report personally, his voice flat with exhaustion. Hitler listened in silence, then exploded. Paulus surrendered. How could he surrender? I made him a field marshal. Doesn't he understand what that means? It means, Zeitzler said quietly, that you expected him to commit suicide rather than save his men's lives. He has disgraced himself, disgraced Germany. He should have shot himself like a man. Zeitzler, who had spent 3 months arguing for a breakout that might have saved the army, who had starved himself trying to make Hitler understand, who had watched 290,000 men die because one man refused to authorize retreat, said, "Perhaps, my Führer, he thought he had better reasons to live than to die for a symbolic gesture." The room went silent. No one spoke to Hitler this way. Zeitzler waited to be dismissed, possibly arrested. Instead, Hitler turned away, staring at his maps where Stalingrad was still marked with German flags, where the 6th Army still existed in colored pins and unit markers, where reality could be ignored if you simply refused to acknowledge it. "Leave," Hitler said. Zeitzler left. He would remain Chief of General Staff for another year and a half. But something had broken in him at Stalingrad. He had learned what happened when you told Hitler the truth. Nothing. The truth didn't matter. Reality didn't matter. Only Hitler's will mattered, and his will had killed 6th Army as surely as Soviet bullets. In the weeks after Stalingrad's fall, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The Luftwaffe had lost 488 transport aircraft trying to supply the pocket, planes that Germany couldn't replace, pilots who took years to train, all thrown away trying to make Göring's impossible promise real. 4th Panzer Army had suffered 27,000 casualties in the failed relief attempt. The Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies had been destroyed. The entire southern wing of the Eastern Front had collapsed. And for what? To hold a city that had no strategic value once the army defending it was dead. To prove that Germans didn't retreat. To satisfy Hitler's ego. The German High Command had no answer. They had realized, too late, that no reinforcements were coming because Hitler had decided that reinforcements weren't necessary. He had decided that 6th Army's purpose was to die in place, to tie down Soviet forces, to create a myth of heroic resistance. He had sacrificed 290,000 men not through military miscalculation, but through deliberate choice, because in his mind, their deaths served Germany better than their survival. Manstein, who had commanded the relief operation, wrote in his diary, "The tragedy of Stalingrad was not that it happened, but that it was allowed to happen. We had the opportunity to save the army. We had the tactical means. We lacked only the authorization, and that was withheld not for military reasons, but for reasons of prestige and propaganda." Zeitzler, in his post-war interrogations, was more blunt. Hitler murdered 6th Army. He knew the air supply couldn't work. He knew the relief operation would fail. He knew they would all die. He ordered it anyway because he couldn't admit a mistake. But perhaps the most damning assessment came from Paulus himself, in Soviet captivity, when asked what he would say to Hitler if given the chance. "I would ask him why he thought our lives were worth less than his pride, and I would ask him when he realized that no help was coming, because I think he knew before we did. I think he knew from the beginning." The evidence suggests Paulus was right. The Luftwaffe's own logistics officers had calculated, before the encirclement even closed, that supplying Stalingrad by air was impossible. They had told Göring. Göring had ignored them and promised Hitler it could be done. Hitler had accepted the promise because it allowed him to avoid the word retreat. The relief operation was planned, knowing it was undermanned and undersupplied, knowing the Soviets would reinforce faster than Germany could, knowing that even if it reached Stalingrad, 6th Army lacked the fuel to break out. Manstein had explained this to Hitler. Hitler had ordered the attack anyway. Every level of high command had known, at different times, that no adequate help was coming. The question was never whether reinforcements would arrive, but when each commander would admit to himself that they wouldn't. For the Luftwaffe officers calculating tonnage, the realization came in November. For Manstein, commanding the relief force, it came on December 23rd when he ordered the withdrawal. For Zeitzler, arguing with Hitler daily, it came gradually through December and January, as every request was denied, every rationale argument dismissed. For Paulus, trapped in the pocket, it came in stages. First, the understanding that air supply had failed. Then that the relief operation had failed. Finally, that surrender would be forbidden even when continuation meant only death. For Hitler, the realization never came at all, or if it did, he dismissed it as irrelevant. In his mind, 6th Army's purpose was never to survive. It was to fight until destroyed, to tie down Soviet forces, to demonstrate German will. The fact that this cost 290,000 lives was, to him, an acceptable price for a symbolic victory. This was what German High Command said when they realized no reinforcements were coming. Nothing that mattered. Nothing that changed anything. Nothing that saved a single life. They argued, they pleaded, they calculated, they sent messages that were ignored or rejected, and in the end, they watched an army die because one man refused to authorize the word retreat. The soldiers of 6th Army had understood faster than their commanders. By December, they knew no help was coming. They wrote letters home, those that made it through, describing the reality that High Command couldn't acknowledge. They shared their rations with wounded comrades who would die anyway. They sang Christmas carols in bunkers that would become their tombs. They surrendered when ordered to fight to the last man because they understood what their commanders had learned too late, that there was no honor in dying for a lie, no glory in sacrificing yourself to protect someone else's pride. One soldier, a corporal named Hans Diebold, wrote in his diary on January 25th, "They keep telling us help is coming. We stopped believing that in December. Now we just wonder how long until they admit it. How long until someone in Berlin says what we all know, that they sent us here to die and called it strategy." The diary was found on his body when the Soviets overran his position 3 days later. He was 22 years old. This was the truth that German High Command learned at Stalingrad, that when you realize no reinforcements are coming, when you understand that the promises were lies and the assurances were false, and the men you sent into battle were sacrificed for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity, there is nothing to say that makes it better. There is only the weight of knowing you could have prevented it, the guilt of knowing you didn't, and the question that haunts you forever. At what point did you realize the truth, and why didn't you act when it might have mattered? For most of them, the answer was the same. They realized too late, or they realized in time but lacked the courage to act, or they realized and acted but were overruled by someone who refused to see reality. Only the soldiers, dying in the snow, had seen clearly from the beginning.